You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Take a look at a map of Africa. Sure, you've been hearing stories about the continuing crisis in Niger, but how many of you can honestly say you know where it is? Which countries are its neighbors? Well, it's right there in north-central Africa, bordered by Chad to the east, Algeria and Libya to the north, Nigeria to the south, Burkina Faso and Mali to the west. And in recent years, that's been a rough, complicated neighborhood. Internationally connected jihadist groups cross lightly policed borders. Northern Nigeria struggled to push back against Boko Haram. Mali has faced constant threat from regional and jihadist armed conflict inside its borders. Niger was the scene of a July coup launched against its civilian elected leader, Mohamed Bazoum. This particular coup, at this particular time, in this particular place, has raised concern and conflict far beyond the borders of big, thinly populated Niger. Russia, France, the U.S., and Niger's regional neighbors have been involved in the aftermath of the coup, and we'll talk about why with Fola Aina, an international security analyst at the Royal United Services Institute of Security and Defense Studies in London, and Nabila Ramdani, a French journalist and broadcaster of Algerian descent and author of Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic, out in the U.S. this month. So Nabila, congratulations, and let me start with you. In response to the new government in Niger's demand that France remove its ambassador from the country, Emmanuel Macron has refused, praising the ambassador for her courage in remaining in Niamey. What is the state of play between France and its former colony, Niger?
Well, thank you for having me, Ray. And I think in order to understand the current situation in Niger, one has to go back to the historical context that led to last month's coup in the country. And it's now 63 years since Niger officially gained independence from France. So you think that France would be free of all involvement in what's going on right now. But that's by no means the case. Niger was a former French colony up until 1960. But even after nominal liberation, France continued to exert considerable control over the country. And this was through a policy known as Françafrique, which is effectively the continuation of the kind of economic, political, security and cultural ties that has characterized the old French Empire in sub-Saharan Africa. So the crisis in Niger can certainly be linked to former colonial relationships being restructured as that France-Afrique neo-colonial nexus across sub-Saharan Africa, which encompasses all those ties, economic, political and military, while also being centered on the French language and French values. And this means that despite the illusion of complete withdrawal from its former colony, France still retains a traditional dominance in Niger.
If you look over the long history since the formal lowering of the French flag in the capital, French troops, paratroops, special forces, foreign legionnaires, have been a presence in many of these countries periodically since the early 60s. Has France been more hands-off since the coup in Niger?
Well, I would say that France has, in fact, retained a quasi-empire in Africa by stealth. But since the coup in Niger and the upheavals in the region, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, I would contend that this quasi-empire has been under threat like never before. As you quite rightly mentioned, to be specific, France has retained a military presence in Niger. France has a garrison of 1,500 troops in the country, together with an air force base, servicing fighter jets and attack drones, for example. France also retains a strong economic interest in the country. Niger, for example, is the world's 7th largest largest uranium producer. It also has gold. But France, which relies on nuclear energy for around 70% of its power, is a key importer of uranium. And there's also the influence of military and governmental advisors from Paris who have permeated successive Nigerian administrations, not least of all the one that has just been deposed. And France, and the French language in particular, remains a major influence on some 25 million Nigerians. French is the official language in Niger through the Francophonie group of nations, which are united by the language of Molière. But I would contend that perhaps the most enduring legacy of French colonialism is a financial one. It's the CFA franc, for African Financial Community franc. It's a currency that was once pegged to the French franc and now is pegged to the euro. And it effectively gives France monetary hegemony over several African states, including Niger. But France's problem is that many Africans are now rejecting Françafrique, and they're rejecting it as forcefully as their forebears came to reject the official French Empire. And in that respect, France's influence in sub-Saharan Africa is disintegrating.
The Macron government in Paris has not been shy about publicly disparaging the men who are aspiring to be Niger's new leaders, expressing support for Mohamed Bazoum. As Nabila suggested, there is resistance to French hegemony. Might Macron be better advised to take a back seat and let ECOWAS take the lead? Let other voices, for all France's influence, let other voices be heard on this so as not to raise accusations of neocolonialism. Is France playing its hand badly, Fola?
So yes, I would say that France's continued stance in the region doesn't help matters, especially with regards to Niger. In other words, it's only simply gotten the junta a lot more agitated and defiant against France's continued insistence, for instance, that it wouldn't leave the country. Nabila already mentioned about 1,500 French troops in the country. But also, for me, I think what is France's concern in Niger mostly has to do with the fact that it was significantly humiliated, having been kicked out of Mali. And in order to save face in many ways and perhaps maybe maintain or retain whatever is left of its strategic relevance and influence in the region, it feels in many ways that our Niger offers that last front to do so. And so completely leaving Niger, not in its own terms, but because a military junta, an undemocratically or unconstitutionally rulership or dictatorship, is being the one to have to tell them to do this, in many ways also infuriates France. And then just to bring this a bit closer to the very latest event. So as you would have heard, there's been another coup in Gabon. And again, Gabon has been a very close country, Francophone country, who's maintained a very close relationship with France. So with Gabon, and then again with Niger, in many ways, France really feels like this is about them. In many ways, it feels like these military juntas are specifically trying to pass a message across to them. But I think that the French should step back, work with other regional hegemons like Nigeria, who currently chairs ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, as a regional body in West Africa, for instance, and try to find a more amicable solution to the problem in Niger, rather than trying to take the lead or exerting influence on how things turn around.
Nabila, has ECOWAS been equal to the task? You heard Fola's suggestion that it might be a good idea for France to step back a little bit and let Niger's neighbors step forward. But since the moment we heard about the coup, ECOWAS has been publicly dithering about what to do, about what comes next, about whether to use military force, whether to use simply diplomatic and economic pressure. They've enraged the new government in Niamey. Has ECOWAS come to any consensus about how to respond? Has it risked looking impotent, indecisive, weak during this crisis?
Well, I have to say that the prospect of another African war is a very real one. And as tensions rise in Niger and indeed across the continent, it is no surprise to find France back at the center of the maelstrom, if you like, as it still fervently supports the democratically elected government headed by President Mohamed Bazoum, who has been deposed by a military junta. And Niger's neighboring states belonging to ECOWAS, the 15 states of the Economic Community of West African States, they have threatened to attack the Nigerian putschists led by General Abdurrahman Chiani. And I would contend that such an intervention could easily be backed by the French, who retain a garrison and indeed an airbase in Niger, but they have so far kept their powder dry. And meanwhile, you have other neighboring countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, who both countries also underwent a coup in Mali in 2020 and in 2021, and Burkina Faso twice in 2022. Both countries also are former colonies that also gained independence from France in 1960. And they are, in fact, saying that any intervention to restore the deposed president will be considered as a declaration of war against them. And you can see the increasing resentment towards the French. And in addition to Burkina Faso and Mali, you also have Guinea's president, Mamadi Doumbouya, whose government was also the result of a coup and has expressed disagreement with the sanctions recommended by ECOWAS, including military intervention. And on the other hand, we've seen, speaking on TV, coup leader, General Chiani, who looked very defiant, and he said that any combined invasion involving overseas and African nations would be met with force. And he said, I quote, if an attack were to be undertaken against us, it will not be the walk in the park some people seem to think. So if the situation escalated and the shooting started, then the French military would be up against fighters sharing a visceral opposition to Françafrique. And remember that African wars were an essential part of the Age of Empire. The first were linked to invasion and conquest, the next to the quelling of revolts, and then there were armed liberation struggles. But France was one of the most ruthless military colonizers, prosecuting savage conflicts across the continent. And its most favorite units, most notably the Foreign Legion, sealed their reputations defending stolen African outposts. There's an argument to be made that France still views sub-Saharan Africa, its former colonial empire in Africa, as what it's called its précaré, its backyard, which is a metaphor dating back to the pre-revolutionary monarchs. It was used by Vauban, who was Louis XIV's military engineer, to refer to conquered territory that needed defending. So I don't think that the French would lightly see Niger drop off their sphere of influence, if you like.
Even if we were trying to draw a diagram with just a small number of players, maybe ECOWAS in one corner, Niger's new government in another, France in yet another, we still wouldn't even get all the way to the level of complexity in that part of the world right now, because there are units, loose and tight affiliates of Al-Qaeda in many of the countries in Central North Africa and West Africa. There are involvements from the Wagner Group, which is now, as we fully understand after the invasion of Ukraine, not an independent actor, if it ever was, but an arm of Russian foreign policy, perhaps given a little bit more leash and a little bit more license than a Russian regular army. But the Wagner Group is mixed up in several African countries. And the United States has in recent years had an Africa command and extended its reach as a trainer, as a supplier, lightly garrisoned but still present in West Africa. This is not an easy situation to find an exit door for, is it, Fola?
You're absolutely correct. To be honest, it's a very complex situation. You've got the Americans with a very keen interest in the region. You've also got the British as well. You've got the European Union. And of course, countries with very keen interests who I would say, are the greatest beneficiaries of the instability as arising across the region, especially with regards to democratic backsliding. So first and foremost would be Russia, which in many ways sees what's happening in West Africa as a confirmation of its long-held belief that Western influence appears to be on the decline. All right. And Russia, interestingly, also is very keen to try to fill in the gaps that have been created as a result of these new developments. The juntas in these countries are coming under the pretext that they are trying to restore some form of safety and security, in these states. And to do this, to a large extent, they have also called on Russia to be able to provide them with the support in terms of military equipment and also actual boots on the ground, indirectly through the Wagner Group, for instance. China also, on the other hand, which is another country, just like Russia, that's also very keen on ensuring the uninterrupted flow of its resources to be able to meet up with its energy needs, is very happy also to try to leverage the situation on the ground. So most of the time, what we've heard people talk about is Russia, 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 with little attention paid also to the role that China is playing as well. But beyond all of this, in many ways also, this could be in some ways attributed to some sort of a proxy war, if you like, between the East and the West. And in many ways, what we're seeing happening in the Sahel region is basically a shift towards, I would say, a new world order. All right, where we're seeing new alliances being formed, not as we would traditionally have expected them to be. And also, in many ways, we're also beginning to see Western influence and dominance increasingly being challenged. But what makes all of this a lot complicated, again, which I feel is among some of the things that hasn't received so much coverage in the media, is the fact that, interestingly, the populations in these countries have demonstrated wide support for these putschists, which in many ways also affects the dynamics around, say, for instance, a military intervention. If you're going to have a military intervention, when the people who you, in quote and unquote, are going to save do not want you to come save them. They do not recognize you as a savior. Whereas with Russia and China, there's a general feeling in the global south that these two countries are better representatives of the realities of this new global order that's beginning to unfold, as against one that's mostly dominated by Western powers, which gives very little voice and equal measure to, say, African countries.
So here we are, Nabila Ramdani, more than 150 years after the Berlin Conference, and it's just a new version of the Great Game, it looks like.
Yes, absolutely. And you're quite rightly referring to the scramble for Africa, which effectively involved European powers annexing chunks of the African continent up until the First World War. I think I would warn against such a prospect, but there is no doubt that the US has always supported France's exploitative arrangements in Niger and Africa in general, originally because former French colonies were seen as bastions against the geopolitical and ideological influence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the notion of France as being the gendarme of Africa, if you like, now extends to it playing a vital role in the fight against terrorist insurgents such as Al-Qaeda in the Sahel region. But I think the question is now, as we're seeing new international partners closing in on the African continent, vying for more influence, I think the question remains that who are these new arrivals and what do they offer a continent which is still racked by endemic problems? Are they benevolent friends or self-interested power players, following in the deeply cynical French tradition of neo-colonial exploitation? And dare I say, I would suggest the latter.
So there's a risk, perhaps one that they're not even really taking fully seriously, for trading the French for the Russians, for example.
Precisely. I think the chief benefactors of such anti-French sentiment will undoubtedly be the Russians. We kept hearing chants of "up Putin" in reference to the Russian president, of course, Vladimir Putin, during demonstrations outside the French embassy. And Putin's forces are already operating in the region through the mercenary group Wagner. Yes, the organization's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has just died in a suspected assassination, but this will not curtail Russian expansion in Africa. Wagner is well established in Niger's neighbours, such as the Central African Republic and Mali, and Africa as a whole is of huge political and geostrategic importance to Putin as he tries to assert global power status for Russia that is mired in controversy surrounding last year's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war there. And Moscow is seen by plenty of Africans as a fresh alternative, if you like, to the traditional Western speculators, backed by the economic and military might of the United States. So it's an attractive proposition, if you like, for Africans who see Russia as an important security partner which can deploy significant military force, even if it's through allegedly independent contractors. And let's not forget that Russia is by far the biggest arms supplier to Africa as well. But I think Fola was quite right in mentioning the increasing influence of China as well. Its military and economic interest across the African continent. Beijing was Africa's biggest weapons provider for many years, and it wants to set up permanent military bases, such as an Atlantic naval port in Equatorial Guinea. And there are a number of African nations who have now signed up to China's $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to bolster imperial-style trade in an area covering 1 billion people.
Yet, the track record with Belt and Road would give pause to a new leader, however he gets there, whether he's elected or he takes over the radio station and shoots the old president. Any new leader of a newly established government, certainly in that part of the world, would have to look at Djibouti, at Sri Lanka, at various installations around Africa and South Asia, and think, is this the best move for us? Not only me and my mates who've just taken over this country, but the 15, 20, 25 million people who are my countrymen. Is China, Fola, just being a new face enough, or do they have a developing track record that ought to give leaders in various places in the world at least second thoughts?
Yes. So again, it's important to remember that only just not so long ago, a few decades now, China in itself created an open economy policy where it tried to, in many ways, liberalize its economy. And that in itself, I would say, sort of like encouraged African countries to believe that, oh, if China, which is situated here in the global south, could do this, then perhaps they offer a very good example to us on how best to be able to come out of the shackles that we found ourselves in for a very long time. So we've done business with the West for a very long time, and we don't have so much to show for this, right? And then here we have China, on the other hand, who has also gone through something similar, but looking inwards and in many ways also turning the tide around for themselves. Perhaps they offer a better example and a better alternative to doing business with. China has also had its own fair share of controversy, just like the Russians, especially with regards to cases bordering around human rights violations, for example. Okay, but for the coupists in these African countries, it doesn't really matter China's record. As long as they are able to do business with the Chinese, they will be more than happy to continue to work with countries like China as a viable alternative to the dictates of, say, France or perhaps maybe the West. So yes, while these countries recognize that pitching tent with China doesn't automatically solve all their problems, for them it's basically a case of having to settle for the lesser evil, if you would put it that way, for example.
That's Fola Aina, an international security analyst at the Royal United Services Institute of Security and Defense Studies in London. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you.
And Fola joined us with Nabila Ramdani, a French journalist and broadcaster, and the author of the new Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic, now out in the United States. Nabila, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. The The program was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer. Our researcher is Adam Ailey. The program was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. This episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.